Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. Today we're going to talk about The Exorcist, one of the most iconic movies ever made. If you look up lists of like the scariest movies of all time, The Exorcist is pretty much always going to be at the top of that list. I've only seen it a couple of times, and even though I'm not religious in the slightest, it is still a very effective horror movie to me. Before deciding to make this video in preparation for the new Exorcist movie that is coming out, I had never seen any of the prior sequels. That's partly because I'm very bad at watching sequels, hence why I'm doing this show, but also because I have not really heard the best of things of any of these sequels. I'm not gonna lie, overall I had a pretty rough time watching these films. I think going back and reading up on the history of them and the making of was a lot more interesting than the actual movies themselves. This is a franchise with pretty much every movie had either a very troubled production or they were somehow ruined by like studio interference. But all of these films are quite different from each other, so that helped. I watched all of these in like 2 days, and the fact that they were so different from each other actually helped quite a bit with that. The Exorcist 2, The Heretic, did very poorly with both audiences and critics when it came out. It is still to this day considered one of the worst sequels ever made. If you go back and read reviews of this film from when it came out, you're gonna find some pretty wild quotes about like how the filmmakers should be ashamed and whatnot. How the film turned into such a disaster is still up for debate, but there was allegedly numerous rewrites that were happening as the film was shooting, and that led to a very frustrated cast and crew. This is the only sequel Linda Blair came back for, and she's been pretty vocal about how the finished product ended up way different from the initial script that she agreed to do. On a technical level, I think The Exorcist is a fine movie. The acting is serviceable to good, and I would say the same thing about the music. The problem with this film is not within its technical aspects, but it's borderline incomprehensible. It rarely feels like a real movie. It's more of like a collage of set pieces and sort of vaguely interesting ideas. There's no real cause and effect to the events of this film. Things just kind of happen with very little explanation to what we are seeing on screen. The movie picks up 4 years after the original, with Regan suffering from nightmares and other symptoms that her psychiatrist thinks are related to PTSD. We are also introduced to a new priest who is tasked with investigating the events of the first film on behalf of the church. I actually like the setup for this quite more than I thought I would. Linda Blair is super likable as a teenage Regan, and I like the butting heads aspect of having a psychologist and a priest around her. The priest is obviously trying to prove the existence of demonic possession, and the psychologist is saying that, this is all in Regan's head, or it's, PTSD, something like that. Where it doesn't really work is how they incorporate Pazuzu into the story. This is the first time in the franchise where they actually say the name Pazuzu, by the way, and this is a complete aside, but they say Pazuzu a lot. This is a type of movie that gets more and more outlandish for each minute that passes, and this is what I was talking about with the film feeling incomprehensible. The original Exorcist has such a simple story about a possessed little girl and a priest who is starting to lose his faith. The Exorcist 2 has a bunch of different plot threads, and it doesn't really explore any of them. There's a point in this movie where we find out Regan has the ability to heal other people. She literally meets a mute girl, and this little girl sees Regan for like 5 minutes, and after that, she begins to speak again. I don't know why this happened, I don't know how this happened, but ultimately it didn't really matter, because it never comes back again as a plot point. From reading up on the making of this film, I assume that they wanted to make something kind of like an opposite of the original Exorcist, where the original is about loss of innocence and evil incarnate. The Exorcist 2 is more uplifting, and it has a more of a hopeful tone. I always respect when sequels try to do something different, but making a sequel to The Exorcist and putting such a big focus on the good of humanity feels really misguided and just kind of like a bad idea. There is so much stuff in this film I haven't touched on yet. The best parts of this movie is when they do this weird form of like hypnotherapy where the psychologist is taking Reagan back to the events of the first film. There are these lights that are blinking, and each time a light flickers, a note is played in the score. So one light is always tied to a bass note that makes a low gated humming sound, and then another light is added, and that one has like a more higher pitched sort of synth sound tied to it. There are stylistic things like this that I actually think are super neat, and in a better movie, it probably would have been pretty iconic. So I didn't really like this film, but I didn't regret seeing it. It's one of those weird films where you almost have to see it to believe it. Like, I don't think watching a video on YouTube or reading reviews regarding the film really gets across how strange it is. That being said, I understand how, at the time, this was regarded to be like absolute trash and one of the worst sequels ever made. It is certainly a bad film, but I'm glad I watched it. So let's move on to Jeffrey Dahmer's favorite film, The Exorcist 3. This is another one where the behind-the-scenes story is actually super fascinating. To get the full context, I think we need to rewind a little bit and talk about the original writer of the book The Exorcist was based on, William Peter Blatty. Neither Blatty or William Friedkin were interested in doing sequels to The Exorcist, which is why they weren't involved with The Exorcist 2. Blatty did, however, end up writing a follow-up novel to the original book and called it Legion. It was released in the 1980s. I haven't been able to find an exact quote where he actually says this, but I get the feeling that Legion was his way of righting the ship, so to speak, after The Exorcist 2. The book Legion became the basis for The Exorcist 3, and Blatty actually ended up both writing and directing the movie. I went into this film with pretty moderate expectations since I know horror fans really like this one, but I was still pretty skeptical that a sequel to The Exorcist could be good. After having watched all of these movies, though, it is clear to me that if you're gonna watch a sequel to The Exorcist, it should be the third one. It disregards all the bullshit from the second film and has a pretty neat self-contained mystery. George C. Scott plays a homicide detective that is investigating a string of murders that are somehow connected to the events of the first film. I'm going to be pretty vague when it comes to describing the plot of the film because I think the fun of it lies within its mystery. However, it is kind of a pet peeve of mine in mystery stories where we, the audience, knows a lot more than the protagonist in the film. Like, the movie is called The Exorcist 3, so we know there's probably going to be some Pazuzu shit that happens before the movie has even started, right? So this leads to the fact that the audience have to wait for the characters in the film to catch up to where the audience is, and it took about an hour for things to really get going here. That's not to say the first hour is bad, I just found it a little tedious. George C. Scott is great here though, and he brings a much needed sense of class to the film that is missing from the second film. The movie also nails the feel and tone of the first film while telling a very different story. Stylistically, this movie is fantastic. Because of its slower pace, the movie can let tension build, and that leads to some pretty extensive sequences that has excellent jump scares. You've probably already seen the most famous one, but in case you haven't, I'm not going to spoil it. It takes place in a hospital and is just fantastic. The music and sound design is also on point, and it manages to evoke the feel of the original. You can tell from the opening sequence where they use the iconic theme music that a lot of care was put into this movie, which is something I can't really say for any of the other sequels. None of the other movies have this level of polish to them. But it's also a little hard for me to talk about this film because even though there were things I liked about it, it never really grabbed me. I love the way this film builds tension, and some of the scares are actually pretty great. But the story itself just wasn't super engaging to me. It takes a pretty long time to get going, and by the end, I just don't know if I felt like the payoff was worth it. It is a well-made movie, though, so I think it's worth seeing, and you can make up your own mind about it. There is actually a director's cut of this film floating around, and that one is titled Legion, like they straight up dropped the Exorcist name and just call it Legion. And I'm interested in seeing that version because I think maybe I would like that one a little better. After The Exorcist 3, it would take another 14 years for another Exorcist movie to be made, and this is certainly a case where the behind-the-scenes story is a lot better than the film that was produced. Or I guess I should say films, because there were two versions of this same story that was made. The first one that was released was the Renny Harlin directed Exorcist The Beginning. And just so you know my stance on this right away, I think that The Exorcist The Beginning is one of the worst films I have ever seen. It was also the second go they had at making this story work, which is baffling. Basically, the story goes like this. Paul Schrader, who is most known for writing Taxi Driver, was tasked with directing a prequel to The Exorcist. The story would follow Father Merrin on an archaeological dig where he first encounters the demon Pazuzu. Paul Schrader is a great get for the Exorcist franchise. He directed Hardcore, Blue Collar, and in most recent years he's directed one of my favorite films, First Reformed. After the filming of Schrader's version was done, the story goes that the studio got cold feet. Schrader insists that he directed what he was tasked with directing. He did not write the film. He read the script, liked it, and directed it to the best of his abilities. That's his story. The studio, however, they decided to scrap the whole thing and bring on Renny Harlin to essentially make the same movie again, but rewritten so it would have more of a blockbuster feel. The notes that they had were that it needed more action and more horror. So that's what they did. Exorcist The Beginning was released, and it was a colossal failure. So they later went on and allowed Schrader to finish his version of the film, because it was fully shot, right? It just needed to be edited and completed, right? So then they released that one with another title called Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. In my opinion, both of these movies aren't very good, but the Renny Harlin one is just a complete catastrophe. So if you are interested in seeing this story play out, make sure you watch Schrader's version, because that film is at least cohesive and you can follow the story. Harlin's film actually has a lot of the same issues that The Exorcist 2 has, which is fascinating because they were made so many years apart. The story is so unnecessarily hard to follow, and it's clear, like, when you watch it, even if you don't know the behind-the-scenes story, it is clear. If you know anything about movie making, if you have a passion for horror or whatever, you're gonna watch this and be like, oh, this had a troubled production. Because movies aren't made like this. They don't tell stories like this. It's so messy and incohesive. It's just... like, I'm not exaggerating when I say it's one of the worst films I've ever seen. If you have seen the film, however, you would probably know what I mean. There is also some, like, extremely horrible CGI in both versions, by the way. But in the Renny Harlin version, there is so much more of it, and it's so blatant and just terrible. But the main problem is the same in both movies. The story is just not interesting. The core idea is not interesting. The characters aren't interesting, even though you have a good leading performance by Stellan Skarsgård in both of these films. They are, however, both of them, a slog to sit through. But at least Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, is a cohesive slog where you can follow the story. So that's it. I know there was also a Exorcist TV show. I quite liked that show when I watched it, but I'm not going to cover it for this since I had already seen it. Make sure to like and subscribe, do all that jazz. I'll come back pretty soon with more videos. Stay tuned and take care of yourselves. I appreciate everyone who watches this channel, takes time to comment and subscribe and all of that. I really, really do appreciate it. Okay, have a good one. Bye.